In 1959, Bumpy Johnson discovered his closest friend of 15 years had stolen $2.3 million from the heart of his empire. He sat in silence for 30 seconds, then gave one order that left every man in the room completely frozen. No anger, no retaliation. Just a decision so calculated it rewrote the rules of power in Harlem forever. What did Bumpy Johnson do next that turned the most devastating betrayal of his life into his greatest weapon? To understand how it all led here, we go back to where it truly began. Harlem. 3 in the morning. September 1959. The streets were quiet in the way Harlem was never truly quiet, that particular stillness where the jazz had stopped but the tension hadn't. Where the last drunks had stumbled home but the night watchmen hadn't yet made their rounds. Where the city held its breath between one kind of darkness and another. On West 139th Street, a single light burned in the second-floor window of an unremarkable brownstone that served as the administrative heart of the most powerful criminal organization in Upper Manhattan. Nobody on the street paid it any attention. Lights burning late in Bumpy Johnson's buildings were as common as pigeons on the rooftop expected. Unremarkable. Part of the neighborhood's natural order. The men who worked in those buildings kept unusual hours. Everyone in Harlem understood that, without needing to be told. The same way they understood which corners to avoid after dark, and which storefront owners were worth knowing personally. Bumpy Johnson's world and Harlem's world were not two separate things. They were the same thing, seen from different angles. At 3:17 in the morning, a janitor named Roosevelt Hayes climbed the stairs to the second floor to empty the wastebaskets. A task he performed every night without incident, without drama, without anything worth remembering. He pushed open the office door, reached for the light switch out of habit, and stopped walking before his hand ever reached the wall. Samuel Price was slumped forward across his desk, his forehead resting against the open ledger he had been working in, his right hand still loosely gripping a fountain pen, as though sleep had simply taken him mid-sentence. The bourbon glass on the corner of the desk was empty. The ashtray held the compressed remains of 4 cigarettes, smoked down to their filters. The desk lamp cast a yellow circle of light across the open pages of the ledger, illuminating columns of numbers written in Price's characteristically precise hand figures that ended abruptly 3/4 of the way down the left page, as though the man recording them had simply run out of things to say. Everything about the scene suggested a tired man who had simply worked himself into unconsciousness, except for the color of Samuel Price's face, and the particular stillness of his chest, and the smell that Roosevelt Hayes recognized from his years in the Pacific as something no amount of bourbon and cigarettes could produce on its own. Roosevelt Hayes did not touch anything. He did not move Price, did not check for a pulse, did not disturb the desk or the ledger or the carefully arranged items around them. He understood. With the instinct of a man who had spent 15 years working in buildings, where instinct was the difference between correct choices and catastrophic ones, that the state of this room mattered, and that preserving it mattered, and that his role here was to report what he had found, not to alter it. He backed out of the doorway, pulled it closed behind him with both hands to avoid making noise, walked downstairs with the careful, deliberate steps of someone managing his own reaction through the discipline of controlled movement, and made the only phone call that needed to be made to the nearest associate of Bumpy Johnson's organization he could reach at that hour. A man named Clifton who ran the numbers collection on the north end of Lenox Avenue and who slept, as most men in that profession did, with one ear permanently tuned to the frequency of the unexpected. By 4 in the morning, 6 men stood in that second-floor office. The police had not been called. In Harlem in 1959, certain categories of event were processed through channels that existed in parallel to official ones, not because the people involved were indifferent to order, but because they had long ago learned that official order and actual order were related only loosely and unreliably. One of the 6 men found the note during a careful search of Price's clothing, folded once, written in the deliberate block letters of a man who had composed his final words with the same meticulous care he brought to everything else in his professional life. 2 words, and then a name. Forgive me. Marcus Webb. The 6 men looked at that piece of paper and then looked at each other, and the room went very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. To understand the weight of those 2 words and that single name, you had to understand what Harlem had become by 1959 and what Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had constructed inside it across the previous 2 decades with the patience and precision of a man who understood that lasting power was never built quickly. The Harlem of desperate Depression-era street fights and penny-ante numbers running was history. What had replaced it was something considerably more sophisticated, considerably more durable, and considerably more dangerous precisely because it had stopped looking dangerous at all. Bumpy Johnson's operation by 1959 was generating revenues that would have made the balance sheets of legitimate mid-sized corporations look modest. Policy numbers processing hundreds of thousands of dollars in weekly bets. Real estate holdings spread deliberately across 4 separate neighborhoods to distribute both assets and risk. A lending operation that financed everything from neighborhood businesses to the campaigns of city council candidates, who would later prove useful in ways that never appeared in any official record. A protection network so professionally administered that the businesses paying into it received genuine, measurable value in exchange, not the crude extortion that characterized lesser organizations, but something closer to an actual service, reliably delivered. There were accountants on staff. There were attorneys on retainer whose business cards listed addresses on Park Avenue and who met their most unusual client in the back booth of a Harlem restaurant every 3rd Thursday of the month. There were relationships with elected officials cultivated over years with the patience of someone who understood the difference between a favor given for immediate return and an investment made in a relationship that would compound over time. What Bumpy Johnson had built was not simply a criminal organization that had grown large. It was an institution, the kind that develops its own culture, its own internal logic, its own gravitational pull on the community around it, the kind that becomes so thoroughly woven into the fabric of a neighborhood that removing it would be less like dismantling a structure and more like removing a load-bearing wall from a building people were still living in. Harlem's legitimate economy and Harlem's shadow economy had grown so thoroughly intertwined over 15 years that most residents could not have told you with any confidence precisely where one ended and the other began. That ambiguity was not accidental. It was the product of deliberate, sustained, intelligent design. It was the genius of the thing, and at the operational center of all of it, managing the flows and the records and the 1,000 interlocking details that kept the entire machinery running smoothly and invisibly, sat not a fearsome enforcer or a ruthless strategist, but a quiet, unremarkable man named Marcus Webb, who had been Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's closest friend since both of them were 19 years old, broke, and sleeping on the bare floor of a 2-room apartment on West 133rd Street, because neither of them could afford the $4 a month that a proper bed frame would have cost. Marcus Webb was not measured against any conventional standard. A remarkable man. He was of average height and average build, and possessed no physical quality that caused people to notice him when he entered a room. He was not particularly sharp in conversation, had no gift for the kind of persuasive eloquence that moved people, no instinct for intimidation, no talent for the strategic calculation that the criminal world tended to reward most extravagantly. He told the same 3 jokes at every gathering and laughed the loudest at all of them. He brought his wife flowers every Friday without fail and coached his younger son's baseball team on Saturday mornings with an enthusiasm that his players found both embarrassing and genuinely moving. He was, in most visible respects, an ordinary man, living an ordinary life in an extraordinary circumstance, And the circumstance was extraordinary entirely because of a single quality that Marcus Webb possessed in greater and more reliable abundance than any person Bumpy Johnson had encountered in 30 years of close observation of human nature. Marcus Webb was loyal the way certain geological formations are stable, not because he had consciously chosen loyalty as a strategy or a value, but because betrayal was simply not a category his character contained. In 15 years of working at the center of an organization that generated constant pressure, constant temptation, and constant opportunity for a man in his position to enrich himself quietly and invisibly, Marcus Webb had never once taken a dollar that was not explicitly offered, had never shared a piece of information that was not explicitly authorized to be shared, had never, in any interaction that anyone could document or recall, placed his own interests above Bumpy Johnson's in any matter, large or small, through 3 arrests, 2 serious gang confrontations, 1 extended federal investigation that had put 4 members of the organization in federal prison, and more individual crises than either man could have accurately counted. Marcus Webb had been the fixed point, the one constant, the thing you could orient everything else around because you knew with complete certainty it would not move. This was the reason, the only reason, and it was sufficient that Bumpy had given Marcus access to everything. Not because Marcus was the most technically qualified candidate for the role, not because his skills were uniquely suited to the responsibilities, but because the responsibilities required one quality above all others. And Marcus Webb was the only person in Bumpy Johnson's world who possessed it without reservation or qualification. Every account, every ledger, every arrangement, every number that actually mattered, as opposed to the numbers that were meant to be seen. All of it flowed through Marcus Webb's hands and lived in Marcus Webb's records. He was not simply a trusted lieutenant. He was the connective tissue of the entire enterprise, the thing that held the separate pieces in their correct relationship to each other. You could not have removed him without the whole structure shifting in ways that would take years to stabilize, which was precisely what made the piece of paper in Samuel Price's pocket so devastating. Not the accusation itself, but the impossibility of it, the structural impossibility, the way it contradicted 15 years of evidence and 30 years of direct personal knowledge, the way it required you to accept that the one fixed point in the entire system had been moving all along, and you simply hadn't noticed. The morning after Samuel Price's death, Bumpy brought in Arthur Greenfield. Greenfield was a careful, precise man of 51 who had spent 12 years as a senior auditor with a prominent Manhattan firm before a combination of financial pressures and pragmatic reasoning had redirected his considerable skills toward clients who were less conventional, but considerably more lucrative. He had worked for Bumpy's organization on 3 previous occasions, always in situations requiring the kind of objective, unsentimental analysis that internal staff, too close to the subject matter, could not reliably provide. He arrived at 8 in the morning carrying a briefcase and the expression of a professional who had agreed to a job and intended to perform it without emotional involvement in the outcome. He sat with the ledgers for 4 hours. The room was cleared except for Bumpy, who sat in the corner chair with a cup of coffee and a newspaper and gave no outward indication of experiencing any particular anxiety about what the audit might produce. Greenfield worked in silence, broken only by the scratch of his pencil and the steady sound of pages turning. He asked 2 questions during the entire 4 hours, both of them purely technical, neither requiring anything beyond a factual answer. When he finally set down his pencil and looked up, his face held the carefully maintained composure of a doctor delivering a diagnosis he had hoped, on some professional level, to be wrong about. $2.3 million, 47 separate transactions distributed across 14 months with a precision and intentionality that was, Greenfield noted in the flat tone of a man describing a mechanism rather than a crime, genuinely impressive from a technical standpoint. Each transaction had been sized to fall beneath the threshold that triggered internal review. Each had been routed through accounts that were technically legitimate, or legitimate adjacent, in ways designed to create enough documentary complexity to delay detection by months or years. The spacing between transactions followed no obvious pattern, but was nonetheless consistent enough to suggest that someone had thought carefully about the rhythm of the organization's internal monitoring and had calibrated accordingly. None of the 47 transactions, examined in isolation, would have produced more than a raised eyebrow. Assembled together, they produced something as clear and unmistakable as a fingerprint pressed deliberately into wet cement. This was not opportunistic theft. This was not a man who had seen an opening and taken it in a moment of weakness or temptation. This was architecture planned before the first transaction occurred, constructed with full knowledge of the system's vulnerabilities, maintained over more than a year with the discipline of someone who understood that patience was the difference between extraction and exposure. The person who had done this had not simply had access to the organization's financial systems. They had understood those systems at a level that came only from years of intimate, daily involvement. They had helped design the controls that should have caught this and had therefore known precisely how to design around them. There was exactly one person in the world that description fit without qualification. Bumpy Johnson sat at the head of the conference table and listened to Greenfield present his findings without interrupting once. The 6 men flanking the table had seen Bumpy Johnson receive bad news across a combined total of roughly 40 years of direct observation, and each of them believed, with the confidence of accumulated experience, that they understood his range of response. They had seen him cold. They had seen him precise. They had seen the specific quality of controlled stillness that typically preceded a decision being reached and an instruction being issued. They were bracing themselves for what came next, each of them running private calculations about what the instruction would be and what their role in executing it would require. Greenfield finished the final number and set his pencil down. Silence filled the room and kept filling it 10 seconds, 20, 30, climbing toward a full minute. Bumpy looked at the report, not at Greenfield, not at the 6 men, not at the window where the September light was coming through the glass in long, pale rectangles. At the report. His face was completely still. His hands, resting flat on the table, did not move. The room felt, to every person in it, like the moment before a weather event, that particular atmospheric pressure that precedes something large. After 30 seconds that registered as considerably longer in the bodies of everyone present, Bumpy Johnson folded the report precisely along its center crease, set it down beside his untouched second cup of coffee, and spoke in a voice so level and so devoid of detectable emotion that several of the 6 men would later describe it as the most unsettling thing they had ever heard from him. In a career full of unsettling things. "Nobody touches Marcus. I'll handle it myself." He stood. He put on his jacket with the unhurried movements of a man with no particular place to be. He walked to the door, opened it, and left. The door closed behind him with a soft, precise click that somehow communicated more than a slammed door could have managed. Nobody in that room spoke for a very long time. That night, Bumpy Johnson sat alone in his apartment with the lights off and the city sounds coming up faintly from the street below. He sat for 3 hours. The $2.3 million he set aside within the first 10 minutes, the money was recoverable. The money was almost entirely beside the point. What he was thinking about was Samuel Price, a loyal, stable, professionally meticulous man who had spent 9 years building and maintaining the financial systems of the organization, who had never given any indication of psychological fragility, who had no documented history of instability or despair, a man who had, by Greenfield's analysis, not been directly involved in the movement of the missing funds, who had been, In fact, the man whose systems Marcus had carefully navigated around rather than through. Price had not helped. Price had discovered, and Price's response to discovery had not been to bring the information to Bumpy through the channels that existed precisely for that purpose, but to write 2 words on a piece of paper and end his own life. The question that Bumpy sat with in the darkness, turning it over with the methodical patience of a man who trusted the process of sustained thought to produce what rushing never could, was simple. What had Samuel Price discovered that made disclosure more dangerous than death? Because the answer to that question was not Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb was visible. Marcus Webb was, at this point, known. Marcus Webb was, in the language of what Bumpy was beginning to understand, a door, a carefully constructed, carefully positioned door designed to be found, designed to draw attention, designed to focus the gaze of the person walking through it on the room immediately beyond, while leaving everything in the peripheral dark unexamined. Someone had needed Bumpy Johnson looking directly at Marcus Webb. Someone had calculated, correctly, that a dead accountant with a specific name in his pocket was the most reliable mechanism for ensuring that outcome. Someone had understood the organization well enough to know that Price's death would produce this audit, and this meeting, and this focused, consuming confrontation with the question of Marcus Webb's betrayal, and had understood equally well what Bumpy would not be looking at while all of that was happening. 3 hours in the dark. Then the telephone. Thomas Caldwell picked up on the second ring, as men in his profession always did regardless of the hour, because the hour was never the relevant variable. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Bumpy said 2 sentences that mattered. Find out who has been paying Marcus Webb, and find out why they needed me to know about it. He set the telephone down and stood at the window and watched Harlem beginning its slow, early morning return to life below the first delivery trucks. The overnight workers heading home, the city resuming its daily performance of normalcy, with the comfortable certainty that the rules governing it were the same rules that had governed it yesterday. Bumpy Johnson stood at that window and understood, with the cold, architectural precision that had kept him functional and alive in a world designed to destroy men less careful than himself, that someone had made a serious miscalculation. They had assumed that showing him the door meant controlling what happened when he walked through it. They had not accounted for the possibility that he would stand in the doorway instead, look at what was on both sides of it, and understand the door itself as the message. That was their first mistake. In Bumpy Johnson's experience, first mistakes rarely traveled alone. Thomas Caldwell delivered his findings 6 days after Bumpy made the call. 6 days of silence from Bumpy's side, no visible movement, no meetings with lieutenants beyond the routine, no indication that anything had changed in the organization's daily operations. To anyone watching from outside, and people were always watching from outside, Bumpy Johnson appeared to be a man who had received difficult news and was processing it with characteristic composure before deciding on a response. The organization continued running. The collections continued. The ledgers were being maintained by interim staff. Everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to look when a careful man was taking his time. That appearance was not accidental. It was the first deliberate move in a sequence that Bumpy had been constructing in the dark for 6 consecutive nights. And it was designed, like everything else he built, to be exactly as visible as he intended and no more. Caldwell's report ran to 11 pages of dense, single-spaced, typewritten analysis. Bumpy read it twice in one sitting, made 4 pencil marks in the margins, and sat for 20 minutes afterward with the pages face down on the desk in front of him, staring at the middle distance with the expression of a chess player who has just seen, with complete clarity, the full shape of the game he is sitting inside. What Caldwell had found confirmed everything Bumpy had suspected in the dark and added several dimensions he had not yet fully mapped. The money flowing to Marcus Webb had originated from 3 separate accounts, each structured to appear unrelated to the others, each routed through a different financial intermediary with a different nominal purpose, traced back through Caldwell's meticulous reconstruction. All 3 lines led to the same source, a network of front companies operating out of Lower Manhattan with documented connections to the Genovese family, one of the 5 dominant Italian-American crime organizations that had spent the better part of a decade looking at Harlem's policy operations and calculating, with the cold appetite of men who had never learned to want only what was within reach, exactly what it would take to own them. The scope of what they had been building was the thing that held Bumpy's attention longest. This was not a takeover attempt in the conventional sense, not the kind of direct territorial aggression that the criminal world usually employed. The kind that announced itself with muscle and confrontation and could be met with equivalent force. What the Genovese network had been constructing, using Marcus Webb as its central instrument, was a map, a comprehensive, detailed, continuously updated map of the entire organizational structure of Bumpy Johnson's empire, every financial account, every key relationship, every point of operational dependency, every place where the removal of a single person or a single arrangement would cause the surrounding structure to lose integrity. They had not been trying to fight their way into Harlem. They had been learning it from the inside, with the patience of people who understood that the most durable conquests begin with knowledge rather than force. Marcus Webb had been, for 14 months, an unwitting cartographer drawing the territory his own organization occupied, so that someone else could eventually move through it without resistance. The question of how they had compelled Marcus's cooperation was answered on page 7 of Caldwell's report, and it was the page that Bumpy returned to after reading the full document. The page that produced the single physical response he permitted himself across the entire 2 sittings, a long, slow exhale through the nose, barely audible, that communicated something that was not quite sadness and not quite anger, but existed in the narrow territory between them. Marcus Webb's younger son, 14 years old, a boy Bumpy had known since his birth, a boy he had given a baseball glove for his 7th birthday and $20 for every report card that met a standard Bumpy had personally set because he believed, without sentimentality, that the children of the people around him were his responsibility as much as anything else. The boy had been identified, approached, and quietly threatened 8 months before the first transaction appeared in the ledgers. Not threatened directly. The Genovese operation was too sophisticated for direct threats, which left evidence and created witnesses. Threatened through implication, through demonstrated surveillance, through the systematic communication of a single message delivered across multiple incidents over several weeks. We know where he is at every moment. We know his routine. We know his school and his route home and the park where he plays on Saturday afternoons. And your cooperation is the only thing standing between that knowledge and its application. Marcus Webb had spent 14 months transferring money from Bumpy Johnson's organization to Bumpy Johnson's enemies because the alternative, as it had been made unmistakably clear to him, was his 14-year-old son. Bumpy set the report down. He thought about Marcus Webb sitting with that for 14 months, carrying it alone, telling no one, maintaining every outward appearance of normalcy across every interaction with every person who trusted him, while underneath performing a daily calculation that had no good solution, only a choice between 2 categories of loss. He thought about what that did to a man, what it cost, across 14 months, to be that frightened and that isolated and still show up every morning and do the work and look people in the eye. He thought about Samuel Price, who had discovered the transactions and had understood, before he made any other decision, that bringing this information to Bumpy meant placing a 14-year-old boy in immediate danger, and who had chosen, in the particular moral logic of a man with no good options available, to become the message himself, rather than deliver one that might get a child hurt. He thought about all of this for exactly as long as it required. Then he made his decision. And then, on a Wednesday night in late September, 11 days after Samuel Price's body had been found on West 139th Street, Bumpy Johnson drove alone to Marcus Webb's house in the quiet residential block of West 141st Street, parked at the curb, walked to the front door, and knocked twice. Marcus answered in his undershirt. A man interrupted in the middle of an ordinary evening, and the expression that crossed his face when he registered who was standing on his front step was something that moved through several stages too quickly for any single word to capture recognition. Then a flash of something that might have been relief and might have been terror. Then a careful reconstruction of composure that didn't fully hold around the edges. He stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds without speaking, which was 3 seconds longer than he needed to understand that whatever was going to happen next had already been decided before the knock. "You going to invite me in?" Bumpy said. "Or are we doing this on the porch?" Marcus stepped back. Bumpy walked inside. The living room was the living room of a man who had tried to build something ordinary inside an extraordinary life. Family photographs on the mantel. A child's drawing taped to the wall beside the bookshelf. The particular accumulated warmth of a space that had been genuinely lived in rather than merely occupied. Bumpy sat in the armchair nearest the window, the one facing the room, and looked at it all without comment. Marcus stood near the door to the kitchen, not quite able to decide where to position himself in a room that had suddenly reorganized itself around a different center of gravity. "Sit down, Marcus," Bumpy said, without looking at him. "Pour us something if you've got it. It's a long conversation." Marcus poured 2 glasses of bourbon with hands that were steady only through visible effort and brought them to the low table between the armchair and the sofa. He sat. He looked at Bumpy. Bumpy looked at the photograph on the mantel. Marcus's wife. His 2 sons. A summer afternoon somewhere with trees in the background. He looked at it for long enough that Marcus had time to understand this was not accidental, that everything in this room was being seen and registered and held. Then Bumpy reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and set 4 items on the table between them, arranging them with the deliberate care of a man laying out evidence in a proceeding that had already reached its verdict. The first was a photograph of Marcus's wife leaving the grocery store on Amsterdam Avenue. The second was a photograph of Marcus's older son walking to school. The third was a photograph of Marcus's younger son, the 14-year-old, the one who had been used sitting on a park bench on a Saturday afternoon. And in the background of this photograph, close enough to be unmistakable once you knew to look, a man Marcus had never seen before was watching him with the particular quality of attention that had nothing to do with coincidence. The fourth item was a single page from Caldwell's report, the page that documented the surveillance operation, the dates, the methods, the careful architecture of a pressure campaign designed to leave no direct fingerprints. Marcus looked at the 4 items on the table. He looked at Bumpy. Something in his face broke open, not dramatically, not with the sudden release of a man who has been waiting for confrontation, but slowly, like a structure that has been under load for a very long time, finally yielding to weight it was never designed to carry indefinitely. "Bumpy," he said, and the word came out carrying 14 months of everything that had not been said. "I didn't. I tried to find another way. I looked for another way for 3 months before I—" He stopped, started again. "My boy," he said. "They had my boy." "I know," Bumpy said. His voice was level, not cold level. The distinction mattered. "You know, I've known since month 3. The silence that followed that statement was of a different quality than any silence that had preceded it in the conversation. Marcus stared at him. Bumpy picked up his bourbon glass, turned it once in his hand, Set it down without drinking. Month 3, he said again. I noticed a pattern in 3 transactions that should not have been related but were. I had Caldwell look at it quietly. He confirmed the direction of the money within 2 weeks. That was 11 months ago. Marcus. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it. The arithmetic of what he was being told was working through him visibly, the understanding that for 11 of the 14 months he had been carrying this alone, convinced he was deceiving Bumpy, convinced he was betraying the one person in the world he had never wanted to betray. Bumpy had known, had watched, had said nothing. Why? Marcus said. The word was barely a question. It was more like a man trying to locate himself in a geography that had just been revealed to be entirely different from the one he believed he had been navigating. Bumpy leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes on Marcus, his voice dropping to the register he used when what he was saying was meant to be heard completely and remembered permanently. Because you were the most valuable channel of communication I had ever had into a closed organization. Because for 11 months, every piece of financial information they received through you was information I had constructed specifically for them to receive. Account structures that didn't exist, operational relationships that were fabrications, vulnerabilities I invented and fed them through you so that when they finally moved against those vulnerabilities, they would find nothing there except the space I had prepared for them to walk into. He paused. $2.3 million is what it cost me to run the most effective intelligence operation against the Genovese network that anyone in this city has managed in the past 20 years. As investments go. Marcus, that is a considerable return. Marcus Webb sat with that for a long moment. The man who had spent 14 months believing he was destroying his oldest friendship had just learned he had spent 11 of those months being used, not betrayed. Not abandoned, not left to carry the weight alone out of indifference, but deliberately, strategically incorporated into a plan whose full dimensions he had never been shown. The emotions moving across his face were too complex and too layered for simple description, relief and grief, and something that might have been, under different circumstances, the beginning of something like awe. You could have told me, he said finally. You could have told me what you were doing. I didn't have to think I was. If I had told you, Bumpy said, you would have known you were feeding them false information. And you are not a good enough actor, Marcus, to have made them believe it was real. The only reason it worked is because you believed it yourself. Another silence. Then Marcus said, very quietly, Samuel Price discovered the discrepancy 4 weeks ago, Bumpy said. He didn't know about the operation. He saw the transactions, identified the pattern, and understood what it meant without understanding the context. He was going to bring it to me. Someone in the Genovese network found out he was going to bring it to me. They got to him before he could. Bumpy's voice did not change in any detectable way as he said this, but the quality of stillness around him deepened slightly. Samuel Price did not take his own life. He was helped. And the note was placed on him after the fact, designed to deliver your name to me in a way that would appear to be a dying man's confession, rather than what it actually was, a calculated attempt to force my hand before I was ready to move. Marcus absorbed this. The full architecture of what had been built around him, around both of them, was visible now. All of it. And the visibility made it both simpler and more terrible than the version he had been living inside. He had not been a thief. He had been a tool. A precisely engineered, carefully maintained tool in a construction project whose blueprints he had never been permitted to see. And Samuel Price had died not because Marcus had stolen money, but because someone outside the organization had decided that the tool needed to be activated on their timeline rather than Bumpy's. What happens now? Marcus said. Bumpy stood. He straightened his jacket with the unhurried movements of a man who had reached the end of one chapter and was already thinking about the first sentence of the next. He looked at Marcus Webb, his friend of 30 years, his broken instrument, his unwilling spy. The man who had spent 14 months drowning in a silence that could have been lifted at any point by a single conversation that Bumpy had chosen, for strategic reasons that were entirely sound and entirely cold. Not to have. He looked at him for a moment that held everything the two of them had been to each other and everything the last 14 months had cost. "Now," Bumpy said, "you get up, you get dressed, and you come with me. Because the meeting I have been building toward for 11 months happens in 4 days. And the person sitting across the table from the Genovese representative is going to be you." Marcus stared at him. "Me? You? Bumpy, they will expect," Bumpy said, his voice carrying the flat, absolute certainty of a man stating a physical law rather than an opinion. "To see the man they own walking into that room. They will expect compliance. They will expect fear. They will expect to finalize the terms of something they believe they have already won." He paused at the door and looked back. "What they will not expect is that the man they own has been mine the entire time. That is the last assumption they will ever make about Harlem." He opened the door. The night air came in, carrying the city sounds from the street below distant traffic, a radio from somewhere up the block, the ordinary music of a neighborhood that had no idea what was being decided in this living room. Marcus Webb sat for 3 seconds on the edge of the sofa, looking at the door, looking at the man standing in it, looking at the 4 photographs still arranged on the table in front of him. Then he stood up. The following 3 days moved with the compressed, particular intensity of time experienced, close to a decisive event each hour, carrying more weight than hours usually carried. Each conversation and each decision landing with the awareness that they were part of a sequence approaching a conclusion that could not be revised once it began. Bumpy spent those 3 days in a sequence of meetings that appeared, to anyone observing the organization's surface activity, to be routine operational coordination. They were not routine. They were the final pieces of an arrangement, 11 months in the making, financial instruments positioned, relationships activated, legal preparations completed. Every element of the structure Bumpy had been building placed precisely where it needed to be for the morning of October 3rd. Marcus Webb spent those 3 days learning the full shape of what he had unknowingly participated in, learning which pieces of information he had transmitted were fabricated and how, learning the specific contours of the trap that had been constructed around the false map he had been drawing, which apparent vulnerabilities the Genovese network had been directed toward, which false accounts they would attempt to access, which operational relationships they would try to leverage, and what they would find in each case when they reached for what they believed they owned. He learned it with the focused, almost ferocious attention of a man who had been kept in the dark for 14 months, and was now consuming light as fast as it could be provided. On the evening before the meeting, Marcus Webb sat alone in the back room of the restaurant on Lenox Avenue where the meeting would take place the following morning. He sat with a glass of water and the particular quality of quietness that precedes a thing you have accepted and cannot change. The room was empty. The restaurant was closed. From the kitchen came the distant sound of someone preparing things for the morning. At 9:47 in the evening, the telephone behind the bar rang. The bartender, the only other person in the building, answered it, listened for 2 seconds, and carried the receiver to the back room without explanation. Marcus picked it up. The voice on the other end was male, accented, and entirely devoid of warmth, the voice of a man who had made many calls like this and found the discomfort of the recipient neither interesting nor relevant. "Mr. Webb," the voice said, "tomorrow morning you walk into that room. I want you to understand something clearly before you do. The arrangement you believe exists, the protection, the promises, the terms. None of it survives the conversation you are planning to have. You walk into that room on behalf of Bumpy Johnson, and you do not walk out of it. That is not a threat. That is a description of what has already been decided." A pause, precisely timed, Go home, Mr. Webb. Tell Johnson you are unwell. This is the only version of tomorrow in which your son watches his father come home for dinner." The line went dead. Marcus Webb held the receiver for a moment after the call ended, then set it down with the careful deliberateness of a man making a small but irreversible decision. He sat back in his chair. He looked at the wall. He thought about his son sitting on a park bench on a Saturday afternoon with a stranger watching from the background. He thought about Samuel Price, who had chosen death rather than risk a child. He thought about Bumpy Johnson standing in his living room doorway with the night air coming in, saying what they will not expect is that the man they own has been mine the entire time. He picked up the telephone and called Bumpy's number. It rang once. "They called," Marcus said. "I know," Bumpy said. "I had the line monitored. Are you ready?" Marcus looked at the empty room around him, at the table set for a meeting that would determine the shape of the next decade in Harlem, at the glass of water he hadn't touched. "No," he said honestly. "But I'll be there." "That," Bumpy Johnson said, "is all I ever needed from you." The meeting on the morning of October 3rd lasted 41 minutes. The Genovese representative arrived expecting a negotiation. He was a composed, expensively dressed man named Carlucci, who had conducted a dozen of these conversations across his career, and who carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who had never walked into a room without already knowing how it would end. He sat across the table from Marcus Webb, noted the absence of Bumpy Johnson with visible satisfaction, and began outlining terms with the smooth efficiency of a man finalizing a transaction rather than proposing one. He spoke for approximately 4 minutes before Marcus Webb set a single folder on the table between them and slid it forward without comment. Carlucci opened it. He read the first page, then the second. His composure did not collapse. Men like Carlucci did not collapse in visible ways, but something behind his eyes shifted. The way a calculation shifts when a variable you had assumed was fixed reveals itself to be something else entirely. The folder contained documentation of every false account the Genovese network had been directed toward through 11 months of carefully constructed misinformation. Every fabricated operational relationship, every invented vulnerability they had spent resources positioning themselves to exploit. Alongside each fabrication was the corresponding legal instrument freezing orders, financial claims, documented evidence of the network's attempted infiltration, packaged with the precision of someone who had been preparing a legal case in parallel to a criminal one, which was exactly what had been happening. Bumpy Johnson had spent 11 months not only feeding his enemies false intelligence, but building, simultaneously, an ironclad documentary record of their attempt to use it. The trap had not been a moment. It had been architecture. And Carlucci was sitting inside it, reading its blueprints. By early afternoon, the Genovese network's financial instruments touching Harlem had been frozen through 3 separate legal mechanisms that Bumpy's attorneys had prepared and held in reserve for this specific morning. By evening, 2 of the network's front companies had been referred to federal investigators through channels that left no visible connection to Bumpy's organization, a referral made possible by documentation that could only have come from someone who had been watching the operation from the inside for nearly a year. $2.3 million was recovered within 72 hours, returned through the same financial architecture it had traveled through on the way out, moving in reverse with the clean precision of water finding its original level. The interest Bumpy collected was not financial. It was territorial, relational, and permanent, a withdrawal so complete and so thoroughly documented that no successor organization would attempt the same approach in Harlem for the next 15 years. What followed the meeting's conclusion carried a different kind of weight entirely, and it was the thing that the organization's inner circle would remember longer than the victory itself. That same afternoon, as the legal mechanisms were being activated and the network's retreat was becoming irreversible. Bumpy called his 6 senior men into the conference room on West 139th Street. He sat at the head of the table. He looked at each of them in the specific sequence of a man who had already completed the accounting and was simply confirming what the ledger showed. Then he said, "Someone in this room told the Genovese people that Marcus was still alive after the meeting was set. I want whoever it was to stand up now, before I say anything else." The silence lasted 11 seconds. Then a man named Gerald Foster, who had been with the organization for 9 years and who sat third from Bumpy's left, pushed back his chair and stood. He did not speak. There was nothing useful to say, and he understood that. He stood with the stillness of a man who had made a choice and was now receiving its consequence, and had enough self-possession to receive it without theater. Bumpy looked at him for a long time. Not with anger. Anger would have been easier for everyone in the room to process. With something that carried more weight than anger, a quality of total, unsparing recognition that saw Gerald Foster completely and found him, in this moment, entirely legible. "Sit down, Gerald," Bumpy said finally. Gerald sat. "You're going to spend the next 2 years running collections on the worst routes in the organization, every morning, 6 days a week, rain or cold or whatever else the city decides to do. You will do this without complaint and without explanation to anyone who asks. At the end of 2 years, we'll have a different conversation." He paused. "You understand what I'm telling you?" Gerald Foster nodded once. He understood. There would be no dramatic consequence, no visible punishment that the street could observe and interpret and build stories around. There would be 2 years of the most tedious, unglamorous daily labor the organization could offer, 2 years of being present and accountable and watched without being acknowledged, which was, in its own way, a more complete form of consequence than anything more theatrical could have achieved. Gerald Foster would spend 2 years understanding, every single morning, what trust cost and what its absence produced. Bumpy had decided that understanding was worth more than punishment. He was usually right about these things. 2 days later, in the hour before the city fully woke, Bumpy Johnson climbed to the roof of the building on West 139th Street and stood at the parapet looking out over Harlem in the particular gray-gold light that preceded the sun's actual appearance, that provisional light that made everything look temporary and permanent simultaneously. The way Harlem itself always looked if you understood it correctly. He heard the door behind him open and did not turn around. He knew the footsteps. Marcus Webb came to stand beside him. Neither man spoke for a while. Below them, the neighborhood was assembling itself for another day. The delivery trucks, the early walkers, the gradual accumulation of sound and movement that meant the city was resuming. Marcus had been given his new role 2 days prior. Formalized in the quiet way Bumpy formalized everything that mattered, not with ceremony, but with a conversation, a specific set of responsibilities, and a clear understanding of what they required. The role placed Marcus at the center of the organization's external relationships, the person who sat across tables from people who did not yet fully understand what they were sitting across from. It was, in its way, the natural extension of what he had spent 14 months doing without knowing it. "You could have told me," Marcus said. He was not reopening an argument. He was completing one that had never fully closed. "I know," Bumpy said. "I lost 14 months thinking I was destroying everything." "Yes. And you're not going to apologize for that." Bumpy was quiet for a moment. The light was changing, the gold deepening, the first direct sun beginning to reach the upper floors of the buildings across the street. "I'm not promoting you because you were loyal," he said. "Loyal men are everywhere. I'm promoting you because you carried something unbearable for 14 months, alone, and you didn't break. And you didn't run. And when I put you in that room, you walked in anyway. That's not loyalty. That's character. And character, he said, is the one thing I cannot manufacture, cannot buy, and cannot replace when it's gone. Marcus looked out over Harlem. The city below them was fully awake now, indifferent and alive, going about its business with the magnificent unconcern of a place that had survived everything thrown at it and expected to survive whatever came next. In 30 years of navigating a world that destroyed men who relied on force alone, Bumpy Johnson had learned one thing with absolute certainty. The most dangerous person in any room was never the one with the most weapons. It was the one who had already decided, before entering, which weapons would never need to be